With the death of Mao in 1976 and the disastrous fallout of both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, China's new government under Deng Xiaoping was eager to pivot away from the perpetual revolution of their forebears and move towards stability and economic improvement. China hoped to achieve rapid economic growth in the coming years, aiming to raise China's per capita GDP from around $250 to $1,000 by the year 2000. The CCP believed that China's rapidly rising population was an obstacle to this and committed itself to controlling it. Their solution was the infamous OneChild Policy that restricted the number of children a couple could have. Today, on A Day in History, we explore the diabolical ways that China enforced this policy through deception, intimidation, sterilization, and murder. If this sounds interesting to you, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel for more historical videos like this. The One-Child Policy was not a single law, but a general policy guideline issued by the CCP and enforced by various local and provincial governments. A letter from the CCP's Central Committee issued on September 25, 1980, which explained the need to control population to avoid economic collapse in the near future, is usually pointed to as the beginning of the policy. The policy was revised and reinforced several times over the years, such as in the creatively titled Document No. 7 in April 1984 and Document No. 13 in May 1986. But local governments had some leeway in how they handled the implementation of these guidelines. Broadly speaking, Chinese couples were limited to one single child. They could apply for permission to have a second under certain circumstances, such as when the first was disabled, and eventually rural families were permitted a second child if their first was a girl. So-called excess births were dealt with mainly with contraceptives, which were available for all women. Failing that, a regime of fines, sterilization, intimidation, abortion, and infanticide comprised a sinister tool that China used to keep tight control over its population. These laws were enforced by family planning cadres in every region and every town. At 500,000 strong, they were one of the most extensive arms of state power and had significant power to enforce compliance and punish dissent relating to the One-Child Policy. Fines were the most common enforcement tool. Families faced a fine for every excess birth, and these were no measly penalties. For example, in Guangdong province, the fine for an excess birth was between 3 to 6 times the family's annual income. There were also rolling fines for non-compliance with other aspects of the One-Child Policy. Women with one child were fined every month that they did not have an IUD fitted and might face fines for missing their IUD checkups. In a society where almost everything was under the control of the state, penalties could come in other forms too. Families with excess children saw their electricity and water bills raised, their grain rations withheld, and licenses for driving or running a business revoked. They could also have their wages garnished on top of any fines that were imposed, and it was standing policy to fire any government or party employee who had unauthorized children. Collective punishment put social pressure on people to comply. A letter received by a Chinese couple from September 1987 shows how this was done. The couple were receiving training in America at the time, but were expected to return to China soon when the wife became pregnant with an unauthorized child. When her factory's population control office heard about this, they sent them a stern warning. Their irresponsibility meant that the factory would not receive any bonuses that year, and the benefits of all workers were at risk. They wrote, "The consequences for you are unthinkable. You would be condemned by all the staff and line employees of the factory. You should seriously reflect on these consequences and come to a speedy decision to fix your problem any way you can. Return to China immediately for an abortion." On the face, these punishments were a discouragement to anyone thinking of violating the One-Child Policy, but they had a more sinister side. A family that couldn't pay for food or water, who lost their jobs and were denied their grain ration, Well, if they did have too many children, this was one way to bring that number down. The strict quotas for compliance that were imposed on family planning cadres led some of them to pursue intimidation tactics. In 1997, the Chinese Daily News reported that family planning cadres were burning the homes of excess child families in rural areas to scare them into submitting to sterilization or abortion. One member of these cadres recalled her experience in vivid detail. "Some of the people we are trying to control want to escape from us. Occasionally, the whole family disappears. They go off to another region. Then we burn their house. The first time I went to a village, I was very shocked by the violent behavior of my colleagues. They shot at people and threatened them with truncheons. But now I'm used to it. It is necessary for the enforcement of the rules. There are too many people in China." Officially, these methods weren't endorsed, but unofficially nothing was done to investigate, let alone punish anyone who used them. Another feared form of intimidation was kidnapping. Many local authorities operated detention centres where violators of the OneChild Policy or their families might end up. Detained mothers could be forced to submit to sterilization or abortion. More on that in a moment, or their family members could be used as leverage to make them comply. The case of Mr. and Mrs. Wu is illustrative of these methods. Both were Hong Kong residents where the one-child policy did not strictly apply, and so they had 3 children of their own. That was unacceptable to the family planning cadres of Haifeng County, where they were living temporarily. Mrs. Wu recognized the danger and fled with her children, but her elderly father was not so lucky. The cadres detained him and sent word to the rest of the family that he would only be released if Mrs. Wu submitted to sterilization. Mrs. Wu gave in and was sterilized, a fate she shared with many other Chinese people between 1979 and 2015. A consistent requirement of the one-child regime was that one partner in all couples who had 2 children had to be sterilized. In at least 80% of cases, this would be the woman, whether they had ignored the earlier contraception demands or if their IUD failed, it didn't matter. In some areas, like Xinjiang municipality, women who simply missed their IUD checkups were to be sterilized without exception. Local cadres were given sterilization quotas and were punished if they weren't met. For example, in 1987, Hebei province's sterilization quota was 90% of all eligible women. It was expected that some would evade it, but the cadres had a vested interest in minimizing evasions. In pursuit of these quotas, cadres held sterilization drives with propaganda campaigns and some off-the-books intimidation to push up the numbers. One such campaign occurred in Jian, Guangdong province in February 2000, where 10,000 people were sterilized in just 1 month. Despite these numbers, at least 7 village cadres were punished for not meeting their quotas. The government officially claimed that they never forced anyone to be sterilized, but the quotas are just one piece of evidence debunking this. The fines also had the effect of driving people to sterilization out of fear of financial ruin. After all, a choice between a fine and being sterilized is no real choice at all. Human rights groups in Tibet also observed doctors performing sterilization on women while they were in for unrelated medical procedures. Doctors didn't need anyone's consent to perform the procedure, and many women awoke from an unrelated surgery to find it had been performed while they were under anesthesia. The scale of these sterilizations was astronomical. Between 1979 and 1998, an estimated 146 million people were sterilized in China, the vast majority of them being women. Of the 250 million Chinese women of childbearing age in 2000, 85.3 million had been sterilized. Some of these we can assume were voluntary, similar to how people today choose to get their tubes tied. But if even a small fraction of these came from fear, intimidation, or financial penalties, then we're looking at millions of people forced into procedures they did not want. To put these numbers into context, the Third Reich's eugenics policies forcibly sterilized about 400,000 in its entire lifetime. Whatever claims the CCP makes about sterilization being entirely voluntary, the evidence simply doesn't bear that out. Despite their efforts, contraception and sterilization could not prevent every pregnancy. The next step was abortion. China's OneChild Policy led it to have some of the most permissive abortion policies in the world. China's Ministry of Health still allows for abortion up to 24 weeks, double the time limit that was laid down in America's famous Roe v. Wade case. Abortion remains a divisive issue, and depending on your stance, you might see abortion as equivalent to infanticide in all cases, or only past a certain point. Certainly, China's policy allows abortions far later than the majority of people elsewhere in the world are comfortable with. Regardless of whether one is pro-life or pro-choice, we can agree that China's permissive abortion policy was not about women's choice. Hebei Province's 1987 quota of 90% abortion rates for unauthorized pregnancies was never a victory for women's bodily autonomy. Fines for excess births were effectively fines for not having an abortion, and, as we saw earlier, even the local factory had no qualms about demanding its employees have an abortion. Too often, these recommendations became forced submissions. A particularly famous case occurred in 2012 when Feng Jianmei, a Shaanxi woman who could not afford to pay the fine for a second child, was held down and forcibly injected with a drug to abort her 7-month-old fetus. The story gained global media attention and inspired fierce criticism of the OneChild Policy. But the unfortunate reality is that Feng was just one of millions. Fines, intimidation, and outright medical deception forced countless of mothers into abortion they didn't want. In cases like Feng's, these children could have been viable outside of the womb when the procedure was performed. Sex-selective abortions were a common occurrence. Male children were seen as more valuable than women in Chinese society, especially in rural areas where sons were needed to work the fields. Faced with the prospect of having a daughter, many couples chose to abort them and try again for a son. Sex-selective abortion is a major cause of China's continuing gender imbalance, where men significantly outnumber women. The problem became so severe that in 1986, the CCP made it illegal for parents to learn their child's sex before birth, and all sex-selective abortions were prohibited. But even if one avoided contraception, sterilization, and abortion, an unauthorized child was still not safe. And it's here that we get some of the most disturbing horror stories from the OneChild Policy. Infanticide was a pervasive problem lurking in the shadows of Chinese society. Sex-selective infanticide against girls had been a common problem before 1949, but early communist China saw a sharp decline in the practice up until 1979. After 1979, it skyrocketed. Understandably, there are no clear records on how many children, mostly girls, were killed as infants thanks to the OneChild Policy. Scholars studying China's population have estimated that up to 50 million girls who should have been born since 1980, based on birth rate and the number of males, simply aren't there. Given that sex-selective abortion was banned, and allowing for some girls to slip through the registration, it's not hard to piece together what happened to them. Some were simply abandoned, left to starve or freeze to death where no one could find them. Willful neglect killed others. One study from 1994 showed that, of all reported infant deaths, girls were significantly less likely to have been taken to hospital before they died. The implication being that parents didn't seek medical help for their girls and left them to die, while they did get help for boys. The unregistered deaths that occurred across China are a terrifying gap in the record, but the deaths we do know of are no less disturbing. While China never had an official policy of killing excess children, the system's quotas for excess births and punishments for cadres who didn't meet them clearly incentivized it, as some parents learned in the most horrible ways. One woman named Zhu told her story of how she became pregnant with a second son in early 1981. When authorities found out, they forced her to have an abortion. Although she wanted her child, Zhu eventually submitted to the procedure. However, the abortion failed and Zhu's son was born alive on August 12, 1981. She was relieved and begged to have her son, but the hospital staff refused. Zhu was sent away and her son was euthanized. Probably the most disturbing story we encountered came from Deng Xiaoping of Zhejiang province. Deng's wife went into labor with an unauthorized pregnancy on October 19, 2002. Deng, his wife, his mother, and his mother-in-law rushed to the local hospital. At first, things seemed well. The labor was progressing as planned, and the nurses confirmed that they could see the baby's head. Whatever joy Deng felt in that moment was shattered by the nurse's next question. "Where is your permission certificate?" Deng, of course, didn't have one. When he explained this to the nurse, she immediately excused herself to report to her superiors. Minutes later, a group of officials from the hospital's family planning office came into the room to interview Deng. Deception was the last thing on his mind, as his wife was going through labor, so he admitted to the officials that he had no permission certificate. He knew he'd have to pay a fine and possibly face other penalties, but that must have seemed like a small price to pay for the child he was moments away from meeting. But that was not the solution the family planning officials had in mind. A few moments later, hospital security entered the room and dragged Deng, his mother, and his mother-in-law into the corridor. Only then did Deng and his family realize what was happening. By the time Deng managed to break free and rush back to his wife's room, it was too late. What Deng saw is far too graphic for YouTube. Suffice it to say, the hospital staff ensured that there was one less excess child on their report. When the police showed up a few hours later, they weren't there for the hospital staff. Deng was reprimanded for making a scene and was bluntly told not to act foolishly again. Even the doctors had no sympathy for him. They explained that the Family Planning Commission had ultimate authority over births and that the medical staff were just following orders. China's OneChild Policy was designed to limit its population growth and boost GDP. Although it missed its 2000 population goal, some estimates suggest that China's population could be as much as 400 million higher without the policy. Others have criticized this projection. Scholars have pointed out that China's birth rate was already declining in the 1970s, and that economic development would have continued to lower it just as it had done in every other developed country. China has achieved remarkable GDP growth, but experts have largely agreed that the one-child policy was at best unnecessary, if not counterproductive to this goal. The policy had a myriad of other effects. The gender imbalance has left millions of young men with no prospect for a family, and the shrinking family sizes have shattered China's traditional family structures. The girls who did live generally experienced a rise in educational and economic outcomes, but that's little consolation for the 50 million of them who should be here but aren't. The CCP insists that the one-child policy was the best thing for society, but the people in that society seem to disagree with them. A poll in 1988 indicated that 72% of urban couples and 90% of rural ones wanted more than one child. Given the powerful social pressure to conform to authority in China, and the CCP's record of how it treats critics, the fact that so many openly disagreed with them is remarkable. Some say that the goals of the policy don't matter. The policy itself is wrong, that the violation of personal freedom, forced sterilization, mandatory abortions, and infanticide are evils that no amount of economic growth can justify. However, not everyone agreed. In 1983, 14 million abortions and almost 21 million sterilizations were performed in China. Many of these, probably most, were done under fear of punishment if they did not comply. Yet in that same year, the United Nations presented the chairman of China's National Family Planning Commission, Qian Jinzhong, with that year's Population Award for his work on the one-child policy. Today, we may look back in horror. Back then, the world applauded it. The one-child policy was replaced with a two-child policy in 2015, and all limits on family size were ended in 2021. Modern China faces the opposite problems of a small fertility rate and an aging population that pose a serious risk to its long-term economic and social stability. In their efforts to solve one supposed problem, they appear to have created another. Only time will tell how China navigates these challenges and whether it, or any other country, will resort to such extreme measures to meet the problems of the future. How do you feel about the one-child policy? Was it justified? What lessons can we learn from it? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to leave a like on the video and subscribe for more videos like this one.